Gambler's Luck by Anthony Darter, Chapter 1. The flickering silver beam of the projector cut through the heavy haze of cigarette smoke, throwing giant dramatic shadows across the screen of the Orpheum Theater. It was a late-night double feature, something European and bleak that Rose had wanted to see, and the theater was mostly empty. In the dark, she felt soft and close. Her head was resting lightly against my shoulder and her hair smelling faintly of the lavender soap she used when she finally got to wash the scent of grill grease and coffee grounds out of her skin. For a few hours, the rest of Los Angeles didn't exist. There were no active cases on my desk, no clients ringing the telephone, and no tracking shadows. There was just the steady, rhythmic hum of the projector, and the warmth of her hand slid into mine inside the pocket of my overcoat. When the house lights finally came up, amber and dim, she let out a soft, reluctant sigh. "They don't know how to write a happy ending over there, do they?" she murmured, fixing her hat in the reflection of the glass-paneled exit doors. "They live too close to the rubble, sweetheart," I said, pushing the heavy brass doors open and stepping out into the cool, late-night air. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving the city washed clean and dripping. Broadway was a mirror. The brilliant red and blue neon from the theater marquees and the late-night jazz joints bled across the wet asphalt, reflecting off the puddles like spilled ink. It was beautiful, the kind of quiet LA night that made you think the city was capable of being decent. We walked slow, her arm looped tight through mine, our heels clicking a steady duet against the damp pavement. We didn't need to rush. We had a little money in our pockets, the agency was doing well, and we weren't chasing rent anymore. For the first time since the war ended, we had time to just breathe. We took the long way, avoiding the main street grime, and heading down the quieter avenues where the shadows hung heavy between the street lamps. Rose leaned into me a bit more, as a trolley rattled past a block over, its iron wheels throwing sparks against the dark. There was a peace out here at night, a rare kind of quiet where the city seemed to hold its breath. We didn't talk much on the way back, just enjoying the damp breeze and the weight of each other's company, letting the rhythm of our steps carry us down the block. When we finally reached the brick building down from the diner where our apartment sat, the neon from the corner drugstore was still humming, casting a soft violet glow over the stoop. I unlocked the heavy outer door, the old lock giving away with a familiar solid click, and guided her inside out of the night chill. We poured a couple of glasses of wine and turned on the radio. The low hum of jazz filled the apartment as we spent the rest of the evening playing a board game before we moved to the bedroom for the night, where we made love, and I fell asleep holding her close to me. The next morning, the gray May drizzle had returned, turning the bright midnight streets back into a dull, leaden LA routine. The office door hadn't even settled into its frame before Joe let out a low, theatrical groan, stretching his right leg out straight across the floorboards. He rubbed at the thick ache left behind by his shooting, squinting through the cigar smoke at the desk across the room. "It's a matter of administrative flexibility, Sarge," Joe grunted, leaning back heavily. "If I want to requisition a single bottle of Old Grandad to keep the circulation moving in a wounded veteran's lower extremities, the company treasury can survive the hit. Betty Sarge, James, didn't even lift her fountain pen from the ledger. Her posture was so straight it looked like it had been engineered by the War Department. The petty cash ledger operates on its own independent ecosystem, Russo," Sarge said, her voice crisp and entirely unbothered by his suffering. "I'm not establishing a precedent where this agency treats a healthy bank account as an excuse for administrative degeneracy. You want premium tobacco and expensive rye? You pay for it out of your personal draw." I hung my trench coat on the brass rack, trying to hide my grin. Hammett, 14 pounds of sleek, unbothered black fur, didn't even blink at the noise. He had claimed the top of my desk, his chin resting firmly on a 3-day-old background check, using the file as a mattress. "He's doing it again, Jack," Joe complained, pointing a finger at the cat. "He's sleeping on this clock. Move him." "You move him," I said, lighting a cigarette. "Last time I woke him up before noon, He shredded a subpoena and pissed in your galoshes. Joe looked at the cat, then at his aching leg, and decided the administrative fight was safer. He heavily stood up, reaching for his cane. This town is going to the dogs. A secretary who thinks she's Patton, a cat running the filing system. I'm going down to the diner. At least Rose doesn't ration the sugar. Don't think you're sneaking a donut on the company ledger, Russo, Sarge called out as his cane clicked toward the threshold. I know the inventory down to the last crumb. I go where the coffee is unmonitored, Sarge, Joe growled, a grin finally twitching at the corner of his mouth as he opened the door. I looked at Joe standing at the door, his hand on the brass knob. Hold up, I'll go with you. Sarge paused her pen, looking up from the neat rows of numbers. But you just got here. I gave her a sly smile, shaking the rain off my hat. Yes, but breakfast calls, and after last night I'm famished. Sarge's eyebrows went up, and a knowing grin broke across her usually strict face. Had a good night, did you? A few times, I replied, matching her grin. Lucky girl, Sarge murmured, shaking her head with a chuckle before diving right back into the paperwork. Joe and I headed down the stairs, the cool air of the street hitting us as we made the short walk down the block. When we pulled open the door to the diner, the warmth of the kitchen hit us like a wall. The breakfast rush was on in full swing. The place was packed to the gills. Dock workers, clerks, and streetcar drivers crammed onto the stools, the air thick with the smell of sizzling bacon, maple syrup, and burnt toast. The background noise was a steady roar of clattering silverware, heavy white porcelain mugs thudding onto the counter, and the low collective rumble of morning chatter. We bypassed the busy counter and headed toward our usual booth in the back, sliding onto the worn leather seats to get out of the flow of foot traffic. We didn't even have a chance to look at a menu or catch Rose's eye before the bell above the front door jingled louder than usual. I looked up to see Polly, Dogface, and Handsome strolling through the door, shaking the May drizzle off their collars. They scanned the crowded room, spotted our booth, and marched straight over, sliding into the remaining space until the table was completely ringed with heavy shoulders. Polly didn't waste any time. He slumped against the high back of the booth, buried his face in his hands, and let out a long, miserable groan that sounded like an engine losing its oil. Veronica wants her mother to move in with us, Polly groaned, his voice muffled by his palms. He dropped his hands, looking at us with pure desperation in his eyes. After her old man died, she don't want her mother living alone. The old man dies, and I get stuck with her. I'll go dig him up and see if he wants to trade places. The table erupted. Joe nearly choked on his own spit, and even Handsome lost his usual cool composure, laughing so hard he had to wipe his eyes. Polly just sat there, looking thoroughly defeated by his own domestic misfortune, which only made the rest of us laugh louder. The laughter was still rolling through the booth when Rose walked over, a fresh pot of coffee in her hand and a stack of menus tucked under her arm. She smiled down at the crowd, expertly navigating the tight space to pour steaming black coffee into 5 thick mugs without spilling a single drop. She took our orders with the quick, effortless efficiency that ran the whole floor, scribbling on her small green pad while the guys kept chuckling. As she tucked the pad into her apron pocket, Joe leaned back, a teasing glint in his eye as he looked up at her. How did your date night go? Rose paused, her cheeks coloring just enough to give her away. She gave a sheepish, quiet grin, the kind she usually saved just for the apartment after hours. The night was wonderful, she said softly. She reached out, her hand warm and gentle as she patted me on the cheek before turning on her heel to hustle back toward the loud, sizzling chaos of the kitchen. The conversation kept rolling right along with the smoke from Joe's cigar. By the time Rose came back balancing a tray loaded down with heavy porcelain plates, Paulie looked like he was ready to sign over his soul just to stay in that booth forever. She set down the plates with practiced ease, sliding a thick, beautifully seared strip steak and a pair of perfectly fried eggs right in front of me. The steak was exactly how I liked it. Crisp on the edges, medium rare, and bleeding just enough into the yolk to make it a proper breakfast. I picked up my knife, cut off a thick piece of the steak, and looked across the table at Polly, who was staring miserably into his coffee mug. "So, is the mother-in-law sharing the bed with you and Veronica?" I joked. Polly let out a ragged sigh and shook his head. "That would be my luck. I roll over in the morning and am face to face with an old bulldog with morning breath." I chewed, swallowed, and pointed my fork at him. "No, Polly, that's just the mirror you're looking at. I'm talking about the mother-in-law." The table erupted again. Handsome nearly snorted his water, and Dogface let out a rare, booming bark of a laugh that made a couple of clerks at the counter turn around to look at us. Polly glared at me, though there wasn't any real heat behind it. "Everybody's a fucking comedian." He picked up his fork and aggressively stabbed a sausage link. "Her mother is staying in the guest room, but if that is not big enough, I have to convert my garage into a little apartment. It's not right for a man to lose the last place of peace in his own home." Dogface didn't even look up from his hash browns, his voice a low, gravelly grumble. "You could just knock off the old bat." "Don't think the thought hasn't crossed my mind," Polly replied without missing a beat. We spent the next 20 minutes leaning over the thick wooden table, tearing through the grease and eggs, while we continued to laugh at and rib Polly about his impending domestic invasion. For a little while, the weight of the city didn't matter. It was just 5 guys, a stack of empty plates, and the kind of easy, brutal affection you only find among people who have seen the worst of the world together. Once breakfast was done, I threw some bills onto the table to cover the damage. We slid out of the booth, adjusting our coats against the damp chill waiting for us on the other side of the glass. I walked over to the register where Rose was clearing a stack of menus. "See you for dinner, sweetheart," I murmured. She smiled, that warm, unbothered expression settling over her face, and leaned across the counter. I caught her by the waist and gave her a real kiss, ignoring the loud, theatrical cat calls coming from Joe and Polly by the front door. "Keep your head down, Jack," she whispered, patting my lapel. "Always do." I turned and caught up with the boys. We pushed through the front door, the jangling bell lost under the sudden roar of the morning traffic. As we stepped out onto the damp LA pavement, aligning ourselves shoulder to shoulder, the laughter died down, replaced by the quiet, heavy cadence of men who knew how to handle trouble. With our collars flipped up against the gray May drizzle, our hands buried deep in our pockets, and our hats tilted low, we hit the sidewalk heading back toward the office, looking for all the world like the toughest gang in town. Chapter 2. The click of Joe's cane against the wet pavement stopped the moment I threw open the brass-handled door to the agency. The easy post-breakfast rhythm we'd carried up the stairs evaporated before we even crossed the threshold. Inside, the morning peace was entirely gone. Sarge wasn't at her desk, and her fountain pen wasn't scratching the ledger. Instead, she was standing over by the corner of the room, her hands resting gently on the trembling shoulders of a young woman wrapped in a damp, cheap wool coat on our leather couch. The woman was hyperventilating, her face buried in a handkerchief, weeping with a desperate, ragged sound that made Hammett perk his ears up from his spot on my desk. Sarge was speaking to her in that low, steady tone she usually reserved for fresh recruits who had lost their nerve, but it wasn't sticking. Polly, Dogface, and Handsome lingered by the doorway, their massive frames suddenly looking awkward and heavy in the face of raw grief. They instinctively fell back into the hallway, giving us the room, but staying close enough to act as a wall against the rest of the building. Joe and I stepped forward, discarding our wet hats onto the rack. Joe leaned heavily on his cane, softening his usual gravelly cadence. "Easy now, lady. Take a breath. You're in a safe place." "She just burst through the door a few minutes ago, Jack," Sarge said, her eyes meeting mine over the woman's hat, conveying a rare look of genuine concern. Completely hysterical. I couldn't get a name out of her. I knelt down in front of the couch, letting the smell of my tobacco override the damp panic in the air. "I'm Jack Morgan. This is Joe Russo. Whatever it is, the rain stays outside. Talk to us." The woman pulled the handkerchief away from her face. Her eyes were bloodshot, her makeup smeared into dark tracks down her pale cheeks. She looked down at her lap, her knuckles white as she wrung the fabric of her coat. It's my husband. He didn't come home last night. He's never done this, Mr. Morgan. Never. He works the backlots at Paramount, building the sets. He's a quiet man, but some awful men came to the house looking for him last week, and now he's gone." Joe looked over at me, his jaw tightening. A missing husband case was bread and butter, but a studio carpenter drawing heavy-handed visitors didn't fit the usual routine. "Let's get you out of the open, Mrs. Pendleton," she breathed, swallowing hard. "May Pendleton. My husband is Floyd." "All right, Mrs. Pendleton," I said, standing up and offering her a hand, guiding her gently off the leather couch. "Let's step into my office. It's quiet in there, and we can get this sorted out in private." Joe followed us, his cane hitting the floorboards with a dull, deliberate thud, while Sarge stayed behind. I closed the heavy oak door to my private office, shutting out the rest of the world. I guided May into the leather chair opposite my desk. She sat on the very edge of it, small and fragile, shivering despite the heat radiating from the radiator. I sat behind the desk, while Joe leaned his hip against the sturdy wooden filing cabinet by the wall, arms crossed, watching her with a practiced, investigative eye. "Start from the beginning, Mrs. Pendleton," I said, leaning forward. "Floyd is a carpenter at Paramount. Why were men looking for him?" She bit her lip, fresh tears welling up. "Floyd, he has a weakness, Mr. Morgan. A vice. He fancies himself a card player. Usually it's just a friendly 5-cent game with the neighbors. But a few months ago, a friend took him to a place downtown. A hidden place, somewhere behind a cigar storefront on Spring Street. He won at first, a lot of money. He bought me the coat I'm wearing, but then the luck turned." Joe shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing through the haze of his fresh cigar. "It has a way of doing that, miss. How deep did he get?" "Thousands," she whispered, the words slipping out like a confession. "Money we don't have. Money he couldn't possibly earn with a hammer and nails." He grew distant. He wouldn't sleep. "Then last week, those men showed up at our door, impeccably dressed, Mr. Morgan. They looked like gentlemen from a movie, talking with sharp East Coast accents, but their eyes were dead. The leader, a man named Frankie, smiled the whole time. He told Floyd that his credit line had expired and that the house always collects its debts. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. I didn't say a word, my mind instantly processing the name. Frankie. A New York crew running games right under the nose of the city. Floyd promised he'd find the money, May continued, her voice trembling violently now. He left yesterday afternoon saying he was going to beg his studio foreman for a loan or an advance on his next paycheck. He never came back to the lot. I called his sister, I called the hospitals, nothing. Then, about an hour ago, I was sitting by the telephone in the hallway, praying it would ring with some good news. She stopped, clutching her small leather handbag to her chest like a shield. "The phone rang, Mrs. Pendleton?" I asked quietly. "Yes," she choked out, her breathing hitching into a ragged gasp. "But it wasn't Floyd, it was a man. He had a sharp, polite voice, like a bank teller or an accountant. He didn't yell. He just told me to listen carefully." Joe shifted his weight by the filing cabinet, his easy posture vanishing as he leaned in to listen. "What did he say, May?" I asked. "He said Floyd's ledger at the house is past due," she whispered, a fresh tear spilling over her cheek. "He said the balance is $5,000. They're holding him as security until the account is settled in full. He told me I have until midnight tonight to bring the cash to a storefront on Spring Street, and then Floyd comes home. He said if I involve the police, they will kill him." May buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of the midnight deadline settled into the quiet office. I leaned over the desk, keeping my voice low and steady, trying to anchor her before the panic completely took over. "Listen to me, May. Look at me," I said, waiting until her bloodshot eyes met mine. "They want the greenbacks, not a murder rap. Right now, Floyd is an asset to them, which means he's breathing. You brought this to the right place. Joe and I are going to take the weight off your shoulders, but I need you to do exactly what I say." She nodded miserably, dabbing at her nose with a damp handkerchief. "First thing we do is make sure you're covered," I continued, leaning back slightly. "We can't have you going back to the house on the off chance Frankie's boys are sitting in a coop across the street, waiting to see if you panic. Do you have a sister, an aunt, any place safe you can stay out of sight until midnight?" May swallowed hard, thinking through the fog. My cousin Martha. She lives over in Glendale. It's a quiet neighborhood. Nobody knows Floyd goes over there." "Good," I said, gesturing toward the door. "Glendale is out of their immediate line of sight. You're going to stay right here on our leather couch with Sarge for a bit. She'll get some sugar into your coffee to stop the shaking. When the afternoon rush thins out, I'll have one of my men drive you out to Martha's place the long way." I stood up, offering her a hand, and guided her out into the main room. Sarge looked up from her ledger, took one look at May's face, and immediately abandoned her posture to take the poor woman by the arm. She led her back over to the corner, talking in that quiet, reassuring murmur that usually worked on green recruits. I closed the heavy oak door to my private office again, shutting out the weeping. Joe didn't even wait for me to sit down. He walked straight to the office door that led out to the hallway, cracked it open, and jerked his chin. "Get in here, boys," Joe grunted. "We got a live one." Polly, Dogface, and Handsome filed back into the room, their large frames instantly soaking up the space. The humor from the diner was completely gone from their eyes, replaced by the cold, professional stillness of men who knew a problem when they saw one. Polly leaned his heavy shoulders against the door frame, while Dogface and Handsome stood by the window, the gray drizzle casting a leaden light across their faces. I lit a fresh cigarette and blew the smoke toward the ceiling. "We got a missing set carpenter from Paramount named Floyd Pendleton. He ran up a $5,000 tab at a hidden gambling house downtown, somewhere behind a cigar storefront on Spring Street. The guy running the floor goes by Frankie, and he's sporting a sharp East Coast accent. They just called the wife and gave her until midnight to clear the ledger, or Floyd doesn't come home." I looked over at Dogface, then at Handsome. "A $5,000 credit line for a studio carpenter means this isn't a small-time back-alley craps game," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "You two have your ears to the ground. You heard anything about a new gambling house opening up on Spring Street lately?" Handsome smoothed the lapel of his tailored coat, his brow furrowing. Dogface didn't move an inch, his gravelly voice cutting through the quiet. "Spring Street is local territory. If some New York imports are setting up tables and writing five-figure markers right under our noses, they're pushing boundaries." "That's what I'm getting at," I said, pointing my cigarette at him. "Is Don Pandolini aware of this Frankie character? Because if there are new players in town setting up permanent shop, they should be paying tribute to the Don. If they aren't, Frankie isn't just breaking the law. He's breaking protocol." Joe stepped over to the corner wall and picked up the receiver of the telephone, and then passed the earpiece over to Handsome. Handsome was the one with the polished tongue, the one who knew how to speak to the old world without scuffing the floorboards. The rest of the room stayed dead silent. Handsome held the receiver to his ear, his posture straightening instinctively out of respect for the man on the other end of the wire. "Don Pandolini," Handsome said, his voice dropping into a smooth, deferential rhythm. "Apologies for the morning intrusion, sir. We have a situation developing down on Spring Street. A crew from back east, running under a fella named Frankie, is operating a gambling house out of a cigar store front. They're holding a studio worker over a $5,000 marker. Yes, sir. We were wondering if they'd cleared the books with you." Handsome listened for a long, heavy minute. The smooth expression on his face hardened into a mask of cold iron. He glanced up at me, then over at Dogface before nodding slowly into the mouthpiece. Understood, Don Pandolini. Clear as crystal. Me and Dogface will check it out. Yes, sir, right away. Handsome clicked the receiver back onto the cradle and looked at the crew. The Don doesn't know a damn thing about them. No tribute, no sit-down, no permission. He's furious. He told me and Dogface to get down to Spring Street right now, kick the tires, and see exactly who the hell they think they are. I tossed my cigarette butt into the brass ashtray on my desk and reached for my trench coat on the rack. You two aren't going alone. If Frankie's got a crew from New York, they'll be looking for local muscle or badges sniffing around. Joe, Paulie, and I are tagging along. Joe leaned on his cane, a sharp, dangerous grin cutting through his weathered face. 5 guys walking into a hidden gambling house looks like a raid, Jack. We can't just storm the castle. We aren't storming anything, I said, buttoning the coat. We're going to act like a pack of degenerate gamblers who just cashed a fat paycheck and are looking for a place to lose it. Paulie, you play the loudmouth who thinks he's an expert on the dice. Joe and I will be the high rollers looking for a private action. Handsome, you and Dogface keep your eyes on the exits, count the house muscle, and size up the security. We get the layout, we find out where they're keeping Floyd, and then we report back to the Don so he can decide how he wants to cut the deck. 30 minutes later, the 5 of us were stepping out of the rain and into the heavy, aromatic warmth of a tobacco storefront on Spring Street. The front of the shop was innocent enough. Rows of briar pipes, jars of Turkish blends, and a sleepy clerk behind a glass counter who barely looked up from his newspaper when the bell above the door chimed, but the air in the back was thick with the distinct, greasy scent of stale beer, cheap gin, and heavy wool suits soaked in nervous sweat. Handsome led the way, leaning over the counter to flash a thick roll of bills to the clerk. A friend from Paramount told us the real selection was in the back room. Said the luck was running hot today. The clerk eyed the money, then ran a slow look over Paulie's massive shoulders and Joe's cane. He reached under the counter, buzzed an electronic release, and nodded toward a heavy oak door, masked by a velvet curtain at the back of the shop. When we stepped through, the transition was instant. The quiet of the rain vanished, replaced by the low, frantic hum of an active gambling den. The room was long, lit by low-hanging green-shaded lamps that cast sharp circles of light over 3 green felt tables. A dozen men, mostly low-level grifters, slick-haired pool sharks, and a few desperate marks who looked like they hadn't seen daylight in 48 hours, were crowded around the blackjack table and a makeshift craps layout. Place your bets, gentlemen, a dealer with a thick Brooklyn accent droned from the center table. Get a load of this joint, Paulie boomed, intentionally slipping into the persona of a loud, obnoxious high roller as he slapped a $20 bill onto the dice table. L.A. finally got a real game. Come on, baby, Daddy needs a new pair of shoes. While Paulie drew the attention of the players and the pit boss, the rest of us systematically sized up the joint. Joe leaned against a pillar, his cane planted firmly, but his eyes were tracking the 2 heavy-set men standing near the back exit. They were wearing tailored overcoats that hung just a little too heavy on the left side, concealed iron. Handsome stayed near the front door, lighting a cigar and noting the reinforced steel brackets on the emergency exits. I sauntered over to the blackjack table, throwing down a $50 marker and keeping my eyes peeled for the man in charge. Through a half-open door at the very back of the room, past the cashier's cage, I caught a glimpse of a private office. Sitting behind a desk was a sharp-featured man in a silk tie talking into a telephone with an aggressive, short-syllable cadence that didn't belong anywhere near California. Frankie. Beside his office door was a padlock on a reinforced basement hatch. That was most likely where Floyd Pendleton was being kept. There was no other place to hide a 200-pound carpenter in a storefront this size. I played 3 hands, lost $40 with a practiced curse, and signaled to the rest of the boys. Paulie made a show of groaning over a hard 8, scooping up his minor winnings, and we filed back out into the rainy afternoon just as casually as we'd arrived. The moment we hit the sidewalk and rounded the corner into the alley where the DeSoto was parked, the degenerate act dropped. "Two shooters by the back door," Joe said, spitting a shred of tobacco onto the pavement. "Standard issue .38s, low-level muscle. They aren't expecting trouble. The front door is reinforced from the inside, but the back alley exit just has a standard deadbolt," Handsome added. "And that manager in the back is definitely the guy May described. He's got 2 more guys in the cage with the cash. I opened the driver's side door of the DeSoto. We got the layout, and we have an idea where Floyd is. Get in. We're going straight to Pandolini's estate. Once the Don hears that these New York boys are running a fortress on his turf without an invitation, he's going to want to tear the roof off that place." Chapter 3. The drive up to Don Pandolini's estate was quiet. The rhythmic slap of the DeSoto's wipers, doing little to cut through the tension in the sedan. By the time I pulled the car into the long gravel driveway of the secluded mansion, the rain had settled into a steady gray drizzle. A couple of the Don's yard boys escorted us through the heavy front doors and into the study. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and expensive Italian Amaro. Don Pandolini sat behind the massive mahogany desk, his age showing only in the silver at his temples and the deliberate way he poured himself a glass of water. We laid out the blueprint. Handsome took the lead, detailing the reinforced brackets on the front door, the 2 shooters with tucked-away irons by the back alley exit, and the padlock on the basement hatch, where they were likely keeping Floyd. When I mentioned the name Frankie and the sharp New York cadence coming from the back office, Pandolini's hand paused over his glass. The silence in the room stretched until it felt heavier than the storm outside. "New York," Pandolini murmured, his voice a low, raspy purr that carried the weight of 30 years of street rule. "They set up a cage on Spring Street. They take $5,000 off a studio working man, and they don't think to knock on my door first. They think California is open territory." He slammed his palm flat against the mahogany, the sudden crack making the glasses on the tray rattle. "They have no respect for the foundation." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the ceiling, his anger shifting from hot to a cold, calculating stillness. "We need to be smart," Pandolini said, a slow, grim smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "We don't just walk in like a bunch of hoodlums. We do it with theater. I am thinking back to Chicago. 1929. The North Side. Al had a problem with Bugs Moran, so what did he do? He didn't send a car to do a drive-by. He sent the uniforms. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It's all about what the eyes think they are seeing." Handsome blinked, his brow furrowing as he looked from the Don to me, completely thrown off. "With all due respect, Don Pandolini, St. Valentine's Day was just a couple of months ago. I don't remember hearing about any shooting." Joe let out a dry, gravelly chuckle from the corner, leaning heavily on his cane. "Not this February, kid. The old man is talking about the Capone operation in Chicago, 1929. Exactly." Pandolini nodded, ignoring the generational gap. "The look, the authority. We dress you boys up as a city vice squad. You walk right through that front door with badges and badges alone. You tell them it's a raid, you round them up, and then you smash the tables, crack the mirrors, and break their cash drawer to pieces. You send a message that New York cannot buy protection in this town. And while the chaos is happening, you clip that padlock, get the carpenter out of the basement, and put him in the back of the DeSoto." Dogface shifted his bulk by the bookshelf, his scarred face tightening. He didn't look thrilled about the theatricality. "Don Pandolini, why play dress-up? We know where the muscle is standing. Me, Paulie, and Handsome can go in through the alley exit right now, put iron to their heads, and shoot up the place. Clean, fast, and no one has to pretend to be a cop." Pandolini raised a sharp, manicured hand, cutting him off instantly. "Oh, we do not go to that extreme yet, as fun as that might be. A shooting on Spring Street brings the whole precinct down on our legitimate businesses. The police chief will have to pretend to care. A fake vice raid? Frankie's boys can't complain to the cops that they got robbed by cops. It stays internal. It keeps the heat off the family. The Don leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes flashing with a sudden spark of old-school resourcefulness. "You need the threads," Pandolini said, looking over at me. "And you cannot use standard theatrical costumes. They look cheap under the lights. I know a woman. She does the wardrobe and costume design over at RKO and Paramount. A very dependable woman. She owes me a favor from a few years back when her brother got into some trouble with a bookie in East LA. She has plenty of authentic LAPD police uniforms hanging around in her warehouse." He reached for a piece of cardstock, dipped his fountain pen into the inkwell, and scribbled down a name and an address. "Go see her," Pandolini said, sliding the note across the desk toward me. "Tell her I sent you. Get measured, get the badges, and get the nightsticks. By nightfall, I want the Spring Street house turned inside out." The address the Don scribbled down led us to a sprawling, nondescript brick warehouse tucked away behind the tracks on the edge of the industrial district. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of cedar, camphor, and miles of pressed wool. Racks upon racks of period clothing, military tunics, and evening gowns stretched into the dim rafters. The literal fabric of the silver screen tucked out of sight. The woman Pandolini told us about was waiting near a heavy cutting table. Her name was Clara Steele. She was a sharp-eyed woman with a tape measure draped around her neck like a scarf and a pair of heavy tailor's shears tucked into her apron. She didn't ask questions, and she didn't blink at the size of the men who had just walked through her door. One look at the cardstock note I handed her, and she simply nodded, gesturing for us to follow her to a back row labeled Municipal. "The Don's markers don't expire," Clara said, her voice muffled by a mouthful of straight pins as she began pulling heavy navy blue LAPD wool tunics from the racks. "I've got the standard issue 8-point caps, the brass buttons, and the leather duty belts. But you boys aren't exactly built like the average beat cop," which I found amusing because that's what Joe and I were not that long ago. She got Joe, Handsome, and me sorted out quickly enough. Handsome looked like he belonged on a recruitment poster, and the uniform fit Joe perfectly, masking the stiffness from that bullet wound to his thigh when he stood straight. Even Paulie managed to squeeze into a riot squad jacket after a bit of tugging. Then she got to Dogface. Clara walked around him twice, clicking her tongue as she eyed the massive, thick-set span of his shoulders and the sheer bulk of his chest. "You're built like a brick smokehouse, honey," she muttered, snapping her tape measure against his back. "I can get you into the trousers, but the tunic is going to split right down the center seam the second you try to swing an arm." "I don't need to swing," Dogface grunted, his scarred face deadpan. "I just need to look like a copper." "You'll look like a burst sack of flour if I don't fix this," Clara shot back, completely unintimidated. She grabbed a seam ripper and a piece of matching navy wool scrap. "Give me 20 minutes. I need to let out the armpits and gusset the back panel so you have some breathing room. Sit down, don't touch the silk dresses, and let me work." 20 minutes later, Dogface was buttoned up. The alterations were seamless, the work of a studio professional. With the silver badges pinned over our chests and the 8-point caps pulled low over our eyes, the transformation was jarring. We didn't look like private eyes or muscle anymore. We looked like the cold, institutional weight of the city. A look I did not miss. We thanked Clara, left through the side door, and piled back into the DeSoto. 5 fake cops in a single sedan drew a few looks, but anyone watching just assumed it was a detective squad on a hot lead, which was partially true. Before we hit Spring Street, I pulled the DeSoto up to the curb in front of a dusty, brick-fronted hardware store on Broadway. "Paulie, Handsome," I said, catching their eyes in the rearview mirror. "Go inside. We need the right tools for a proper demolition." pick up 3 or 4 firemen's axes, the heavy ones with the red heads and the pick shanks on the back. If we're going to play the Vice Squad smashing up an illegal joint, we aren't going to use our fucking boots. We're going to do it right. Handsome grinned, adjusting his police cap. A little civic improvement, Jack. We'll be right back. A few minutes later, the two of them walked out carrying a heavy burlap sack, the distinct solid clunk of forged steel echoing from inside. They tossed the sack into the trunk of the DeSoto, next to the spare tire. I put the car in gear, the engine purring smoothly as we rolled back toward the downtown core. The sky was getting darker, the shadows stretching long between the concrete buildings, and the midnight deadline was creeping up on the dashboard clock. "All right, boys," I said, keeping my eyes on the wet asphalt ahead. "We have the look, we have the tools, and we have the Don's blessing. Next stop is Spring Street. Let's go put these New York assholes out of business." Chapter 4. The DeSoto rolled to a stop along the curb of Spring Street, the engine idling with a low, menacing purr that was swallowed by the steady thrum of the rain. Through the fogged windshield, the green neon sign of the cigar shop bled into the wet asphalt. No one spoke. We just reached into the back and pulled the heavy firemen's axes out of the burlap sack. Underneath the stiff navy blue wool of our LAPD tunics, our muscles were wound tight. I adjusted the 8-point cap, pulling the brim low over my eyes, feeling the cold, familiar weight of the badge pinned to my chest. A badge I didn't want to be wearing again. "Paulie, take the alley door," I ordered, my voice dropping into a flat, hard register. "Don't let any of Frankie's shooters get behind us. The rest of you, follow my lead. We go in fast, we go in loud, and we make them believe the city owns their fucking souls." We spilled out of the sedan, the rain hitting our heavy wool shoulders as we crossed the pavement in 3 long strides. I kicked the brass-handled door of the tobacco shop open so hard the overhead bell shrieked, shattering the quiet storefront. The sleepy clerk behind the counter leaped out of his chair, his eyes going wide as saucers at the sight of 4 uniformed officers gripping heavy red-headed axes. Before he could even think about reaching under the counter for the electronic buzzer, Dogface brought the butt of his axe down across the glass display case, shattering it into 1,000 glittering shards. "Police raid!" Joe roared, his voice bouncing off the walls with the authority of a seasoned sergeant. "Down on the floor, you bastard! Keep your hands where I can see them!" The clerk hit the floorboards like a dropped sack of flour. Handsome didn't wait. He stepped up to the heavy oak door, masked by the velvet curtain, and put his boot directly into the lock. The frame splintered, the door tore off its hinges, and the 5 of us surged into the smoky, frantic hum of the hidden gambling den. The transition was instantaneous chaos. "Vice Squad," I bellowed, stepping into the center of the room. "Nobody move! Establish a perimeter!" For a fraction of a second, the room froze. Then the panic hit. Punks dropped their cards, chips rained down onto the green felt like plastic hail, and a dozen desperate marks scrambled for the exits. "Start chopping, boys," I growled. Paulie and Dogface unleashed. The heavy steel of the firemen's axes whistled through the thick smoke. Crack. Dogface brought his blade down dead center into the craps table, splitting the polished oak wide open and sending the dice bouncing across the floor. Smash! Paulie swung parallel, shattering a massive mirrored beer sign on the wall, raining silvered glass down onto the screaming players. Men were screaming, scrambling over one another, desperately trying to reach the front doors. As I pushed my way through the stampede toward the back of the room, my eyes locked onto a couple of faces trying to duck into the shadows. Through the haze, I recognized the slick, expensive profile of an assistant city attorney, his face pale as paper, as he tried to cover his head with a coat. Right behind him, scrambling toward the side wall, were 2 off-duty precinct detectives I'd seen around downtown. They weren't fighting back. They were fleeing. They didn't want their names on a vice ledger, even a fake one. While Handsome Joe kept the crowd corralled, smashing the cashier's cage and splitting the cash drawer into splinters, I worked my way past the broken roulette wheel toward the private office at the very back. My eyes met with the heavy padlock on the reinforced basement hatch right beside the manager's door. That's where he is. I hoisted the fireman's axe, twisting my hips to get the full weight of my shoulders behind it, and brought the sharp pick shank down directly into the padlock. Sparks flew. The steel groaned, but it held. I hauled it back and swung again, the heavy blade biting deep into the reinforced wood surrounding the latch. The wood splintered, the iron brackets tore free, and the hatch doors banged open into the darkness below. "Floyd!" I shouted, dropping the axe and reaching for the service revolver tucked into my belt. I didn't get an answer from the basement. Instead, the door to the private office swung open, and I found myself looking down the barrel of a snub-nosed .38. Standing in the doorway was Frankie. His silk tie was perfectly straight, his sharp East Coast features entirely unfazed by the screaming, the flying glass, or the sound of axes tearing his business to pieces. He looked at my navy tunic, his eyes tracking up to the silver badge on my chest, and a slow, mocking smirk spread across his face. "Nice threads, pal," Frankie sneered, his sharp New York cadence cutting right through the din of the destruction. "But you overplayed the hand. You think I don't know who's on the pad in this town? I pay the city council and I pay the precinct captain. If this was a real vice raid, I would have gotten a phone call 3 fucking hours ago to clear the registers." He stepped back into the office, keeping the gun leveled at my chest. "I don't know who the hell you are under that blue suit, copper, but I'm going to find out. And when I do, I'm going to take every single thing you care about in this city and turn it to ash." He kicked a chair aside, revealing Floyd Pendleton sitting on the floor behind the desk. The studio carpenter was hogtied, his face bruised and bloody. His eyes went wide with a sudden, desperate look of pure relief when he saw my uniform. "Officer, thank God!" Floyd choked out through a split lip, his voice trembling. "They're gonna—" Before I could clear my holster, Frankie dropped the barrel of the snub-nosed cloth .38 down toward the back of Floyd's head. Blam! The muzzle flash lit up the cramped office. The violent, deafening crack echoed off the plaster walls. Floyd's body went instantly limp, collapsing hard against the legs of the desk as a dark pool began to spread across the floorboards and the blood poured from his mouth. The room went dead silent in my ears. Frankie didn't even look down at the body. He just raised his eyes back to mine, his smirk widening into a cold, sociopathic grin as he tucked the smoking gun back into his jacket. "That's how much I care about $5,000, you local prick," Frankie whispered, his eyes dead as flint. "I can blow it away like it's nothing." Before I could squeeze the trigger of my service weapon, Frankie turned on his heel and dived through a hidden beaded curtain at the back of the office. By the time I kicked the desk aside and tore through the curtain, the heavy iron deadbolt of the secret alley exit was swinging open. I burst out into the dark, pouring rain of the alley, my gun raised, but the night had already swallowed him. All that was left was the distant, echoing roar of a V8 engine gunning its way onto Broadway, its tires screeching against the wet pavement as Frankie vanished into the LA night. The drive back from Spring Street was a hollow, suffocating silence. The 5 of us shed the LAPD uniforms in the back of the warehouse, throwing them back to a pale, quiet Clara Steele before piling back into the DeSoto. We were just men in wet trench coats again, but the smell of cordite and the image of Floyd Pendleton's final, relieved expression followed us all the way up the stairs of the agency. May was still on the leather couch, a half-empty mug of cold, sugared coffee resting between her white-knuckled hands. The moment the heavy oak door opened and she saw our faces, she didn't even ask. The hope died instantly in her eyes, replaced by a terrible hollow vacuum. I knelt down in front of her again, the words tasting like ash in my throat as I told her the truth, that we found him, but we were too late. The weeping that followed wasn't hysterical like before. It was a quiet, broken sound that seemed to sap the air right out of the room. Sarge immediately moved in, wrapping her arms around the poor woman, signaling with a sharp, heavy look over her shoulder for the rest of us to give them the room. We retreated into my private office. Joe leaned his hip against the filing cabinet, his knuckles white around the handle of his cane, staring out the window into the bleak LA downpour. Polly, Dogface, and Handsome stood like statues. We had smashed the joint to splinters, but Frankie was gone. Before I could even light a cigarette to take the edge off, the telephone on my desk shattered the quiet, its sharp bell ringing with an aggressive, demanding cadence. Sarge cracked the office door open, the receiver already in her hand, her face uncharacteristically pale. "It's Chief William Parker, Jack," Sarge said, handing me the heavy black handset across the desk. I took the phone and held it to my ear, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Morgan. What the fuck were you thinking, Jack? Staging a fake raid?" Parker's voice exploded through the wire, raw with a fury that rattled the diaphragm of the receiver. "You were spotted by a city official and an off-duty detective, all of which are on the take of this New York prick's illegal gambling ring," I fired back, my voice dropping into a dangerous, razor-sharp register. "Don't come to me with any self-righteous bullshit, Bill." There was a heavy, static-filled beat on the other end of the line, the sound of Parker drawing a long, ragged breath to keep from ripping the phone out of the wall at Central Precinct. "They know who you are, Jack," Parker said, his tone dropping from screaming rage to a cold, grim gravity that made Joe turn his head from the window. "You, Russo, probably even the guys with you. Your whole crew is in danger. That's why I'm calling." The temperature in the office felt like it dropped 20 degrees. I gripped the Bakelite handset tighter. "Did you know about this? Are you on the fucking take as well, Parker?" "No, Jack," Parker said, a heavy, exhausted sigh whistling through the receiver. "I'm just finding out." "Then listen to me," I snapped, leaning over the desk. They were holding a Paramount set carpenter named Floyd Pendleton over a $5,000 marker. I cracked the basement hatch to get him out, and Frankie put a snub-nosed .38 to the back of the man's head and blew his brains out right in front of me. He didn't give a shit about the money. It was a message. Another long silence stretched across the wire. Parker was a bureaucrat, but he was still a cop. And the brutal reality of an East Coast execution on Spring Street was a pill he couldn't swallow easily. "You know they are just going to set up shop in another location," Parker said quietly, the institutional weight of the LAPD sounding suddenly tired. "A crew with that kind of backing doesn't just pack up and go back to Brooklyn because a few tables got broken." I looked across the room at Joe, then out at Polly, Dogface, and Handsome. The grief from the outer room was still leaking under the door, and the memory of Frankie's smug, dead-eyed smirk was burned into my retinas. "When they do," I threatened, the words dripping with a cold, absolute promise, "we will smash that fucking place as well." Chapter 5. The storm finally ran out of steam around dawn, leaving the city drowning in a thick, gray-ground fog that rolled in from the coast. The neon signs along Broadway stayed lit well past sunrise, bleeding sickly pinks and greens into the mist. LA looked washed out, sluggish, and cold. We spent the early hours of the morning doing the grim, quiet logistics that come with a body. I didn't want the real LAPD precinct boys descending on May Pendleton's house with notebooks and questions she couldn't answer without getting herself or us killed. I had Handsome use a payphone down the block to tip off an old contact in the coroner's office about an unidentified male in the Spring Street storefront. By sunrise, Floyd was officially on a steel slab, and May was safely tucked away at her cousin Martha's place in Glendale, wrapped in a blanket of grief that would take years to lift. By 9, the main room of the agency felt like a waiting room in a mausoleum. The adrenaline from the axes and the smoke had completely evaporated, leaving a bone-deep fatigue in its place. Nobody had slept. Polly sat on the small wooden stool by the door, mindlessly turning a heavy brass pocket watch over and over in his massive palms. Dogface was over by the filing cabinets, using an oil stone to meticulously work the nicks out of his pocket knife. The rhythmic scritch of the steel against the stone, the only sound in the room. Joe's at his desk, his trench coat slung over the back of his chair. He sat with his hands resting on his cane, his jaw tight. The damp weather always made that old train-yard bullet wound in his thigh act up, the deep stiffness settling into the bone whenever the rain rolled in through the basin. He didn't say a word about it, but the extra weight he put on the cane when he shifted his posture told the whole story. I stood by the window, my forehead pressed against the cool glass, watching the yellow cabs crawl through the fog below. My hands were shoved deep into my pockets, my fingers brushing against the knurled grip of the heavy .45 tucked into my waistband. Parker wasn't bluffing, Joe said, breaking the silence, his gravelly voice lower than usual and worn thin by the lack of sleep. Frankie's people aren't going to dig through the city directory to find us. They're already asking the right people. A crew that big, with that much grease in the city hall, they'll have our names before the coroner finishes the paperwork on Pendleton. Let them ask, Dogface grunted, not missing a stroke on the oil stone. Names don't stop bullets. Oh, Joe countered, his sharp eyes snapping up to meet Dogface's. But they'd tell them where to send them. We aren't sitting in a bunker, kid. We got routines. We got a storefront. We got people. The mention of people hung in the air like heavy smoke. Nobody said her name, but we were all thinking about the diner down the block. We were thinking about Rose pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs, completely oblivious to the fact that a New York sociopath had just promised to turn everything I cared about into ash. I walked over to my desk, picked up a fresh pack of Camels, and flicked the bottom until a single cigarette popped out. I lit it, taking a long, dragging pull of the Turkish blend and letting the smoke trail out of my nose. Handsome shifted his weight from where he was leaning against the doorframe, his usual immaculate posture, looking a little slumped. He looked over at Dogface, then back to me. The Don already knows the score, Handsome said, his tone dead serious. Dogface and I checked in with the estate an hour ago while you were sorting out the widow. Pandolini is furious. He's turning the neighborhood inside out. Dogface stopped the oil stone for a second, looking up. Before the noon whistles blow, the old man will have extra eyes on every corner between this office and the boulevard. His boys are already calling the shopkeepers, the newsies, the tailors, anyone who sees a strange sedan idling, anyone who hears a New York accent asking for directions. They report straight back to the family. Frankie thinks he can stalk these streets. We're putting a net over the whole district. I nodded, the smoke from the Camel curling toward the ceiling. Having Pandolini's network, standardizing the perimeter, took a bit of the weight off, but the dread was still thick enough to choke on. Good, I said, but we still have to play it smart. For now, we do exactly what we always do. We keep the doors open. We take the small-time cases, the missing store clerks, the penny ante runaways. We look like a regular, everyday detective agency running a regular, everyday racket. If we freeze up or start locking the doors in broad daylight, Frankie knows he's got us rattled. We let him think we're just local private eyes who bit off more than they could chew and are now hiding under the covers. Paulie finally snapped his pocket watch shut with a sharp clack. And when he finds out we aren't hiding, then we'll be ready for him, I said, looking around at the four of them. They were tired, their eyes bloodshot and dark-rimmed from the long night. But there wasn't a flicker of fear in the room. There was dread, sure, a heavy, suffocating weight that sat on the back of everyone's neck. But it didn't slow them down. These weren't men who broke under a threat. They were the iron foundation of this city's underbelly. And Frankie was about to find out that L.A. wasn't as soft as the movie screens made it look. Handsome, you and Dogface stay close to the wire, in case Pandolini's net catches a whisper, I said, turning back toward my desk. Then I caught Paulie's eye. Paulie, go down to the corner and keep an eye on the street. If a car idles out front for more than 2 cycles of the traffic light, I want the license number. Don't engage, just get the plates. Paulie nodded, the familiar routine of surveillance giving him a purpose, a shield against the heavy waiting game we were forced to play. He pulled his hat low and filed out quietly, leaving Handsome and Dogface keeping watch in the outer room, and just Joe and me in the private office. Sarge walked in from the outer room, carrying a fresh pot of black coffee. She didn't say a word as she set a mug on my desk and one on Joe's. She looked at the dark tracks under my eyes, reached out, and gave my shoulder a brief, firm squeeze before retreating back to her ledger. Joe took a long sip of the hot coffee, leaning back in his chair with a heavy groan. "It's the quiet that gets you, Jack," he murmured, staring at the black liquid in his mug, the waiting for the match to strike. I sat down behind my desk, pulling a stack of old, unfinished paperwork toward me, just to have something to do with my hands. The fog outside was thickening, turning the windows into solid squares of slate. "Let it stay quiet for a bit, Joe," I muttered, stubbing out the Camel in the brass ashtray. "Because once it starts up again, it isn't going to stop until someone's buried." Then, a soft, familiar weight hit the corner of the desk. Hammett leaped up with effortless, silent grace, his dark fur slicked down, his yellow eyes fixing on me with that quiet, unblinking intensity. I let out a long breath, a genuine one, and leaned back in my chair. I started spitballing ideas to the cat. It was an old habit, a leftover ritual from the days when I was a lone wolf detective working out of a single, cramped apartment with nothing but a bottle of rye and a shadow for company. I laid it out for him in a low whisper. The New York muscle, the assistant city attorney on the take, the high-end capital it took for Frankie to shrug off a $5,000 loss. And the net Pandolini was casting across Broadway. I knew the cat would provide no feedback. He just sat there, his tail curling slowly around his paws, watching the ash burn down on my camel. But the comfort I found in Hammett was a comfort I couldn't find anywhere else in this jagged, violent city. He didn't ask for justifications, and he didn't care about the stains on my shirt. Hammett knew more about Jack Morgan than even my wife did. He had seen the nights the whiskey couldn't drown the pain, and the mornings the ghosts wouldn't leave alone. As I stopped talking, Hammett stepped closer across the blotter. He extended a paw, resting it squarely against my shoulder, and leaned in, rubbing his head firmly against my cheek with a low rhythmic purr that vibrated right through my jaw. The cold weight in my chest loosened just a fraction. I reached up with a rough hand, scratching him right behind the ears where he liked it. "I love you, boy," I murmured softly into his fur, the honesty of it stark against the grim walls of the room. "I won't let anything happen to you." The cat leaned into the touch. My constant companion. One of the only real things left in a world full of fake cops, dead marks, and promises of blood. I sat there for a long time, just watching the smoke rise, waiting for the match to strike. Hammett curled up on my desk. I rested my head beside him, listening to him purr, knowing the shoe could drop at any moment. Chapter 6. The rest of the day was entirely uneventful, the kind of forced, unnatural quiet that leaves your nerves frayed and your ears ringing. No unfamiliar sedans cruised past the traffic lights. Pandolini's neighborhood net reported 0 whispers. And the phone on my desk stayed dead. By 6 o'clock, the fog had completely swallowed the street lamps, and the heavy tension in the room had settled into a frustrating, dull ache. One by one, the guys cleared out for the night, leaving through the side door with their hats pulled low and their hands deep in their trenchcoat pockets. Sarge stayed late to finish balancing the week's ledgers, her fountain pen scratching methodically against the heavy paper. I told her not to walk home alone, but she gave me that trademark stubborn look of hers and told me she'd been handling the LA streets since before I had a badge. I left her locking up the heavy glass doors of the agency, pulled my coat collar up against the dampness, and drove the DeSoto home. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, the house dead quiet around me. Rose was asleep next to me, and Hammett was sitting beside me. I had the heavy .45 stripped down on a towel, cleaning the grit out of the slide just to have something to do with my hands. Then, the telephone on my bedside table shattered the silence, the sharp bell making me drop the oil rag. I snatched the receiver off the cradle before the second ring could start. "Morgan!" I barked into the mouthpiece. "Jack!" Sarge's voice came through the wire. She sounded like she was back in her apartment, her breathing controlled, but there was an underlying tightness there that I'd never heard from her in all the time we'd worked together. "They found us." My grip tightened on the Bakelite handset. "What the hell happened? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, taking a slow, deliberate breath. But Frankie sent a messenger. I left the office around 7 and started walking. 2 blocks in, I noticed a black Lincoln crawling along the curb half a block behind me. At first, I brushed it off. I made a stop at the corner market to pick up some eggs and cold cuts for dinner, thinking it might just be a coincidence. And it wasn't, I muttered, my blood starting to simmer. "Oh," Sarge countered, her voice dropping into a hard, flat register. When I came out, the car was sitting right across the street, just idling in the fog. They tracked me all the way down the block. When they wouldn't drop off, I made a move. I ducked into that narrow alleyway between the printing shop and the boarded-up warehouse. I stood up, the phone cord stretching taut as I stared out my dark bedroom window into the mist. "Jesus, Sarge, you should have stayed on the main drag." "I wanted them off my back, Jack, and it worked," she snapped, a flash of her usual steel cutting through the wire. The Lincoln stopped right at the mouth of the alley. The passenger door opened, and a guy in a sharp overcoat stepped out and walked right into the dark after me. He didn't make it 3 feet inside before I stepped out from behind a crate. I cocked the hammer back on my piece and pressed the barrel right against his temple. A grim smile pulled at the corner of my mouth, but the ice in my stomach didn't melt. Did he talk? "I told him if he didn't stop following me, I'd blow his fucking head off," Sarge said. I could hear the faint clink of a glass on her end. She was taking a drink to settle the adrenaline. But he didn't even blink, Jack. He just stood there with the gun to his skull, looked at me in the dark, and gave me that greasy, slick New York smirk. He said, "Just give a message to the boys. Tell them Frankie says hi." Then he backed out, got back in the Lincoln, and they tore off onto Broadway. My jaw clenched so hard, a sharp pain shot up into my ear. The quiet cool down was over. Frankie hadn't spent the day hiding out or looking for new real estate. He had spent it hunting our people, tracking our routines, and proving he could touch anyone in our circle whenever he felt like it. "Listen to me, Sarge," I ordered, my voice dropping into a low, lethal tone. "Lock your doors. Put the chain on. Keep that iron sitting right on the table next to you tonight." "I can take care of myself, Jack," she said, her voice steadying. "I handled him." "You handled one guy delivering a card," I fired back, looking down at the reassembled 45 sitting on my nightstand. "The rules just changed. Frankie wants to say hi. Tomorrow morning we go give him our fucking answer. I'm calling Joe right now. We're putting guards on your building before midnight." I slammed the receiver back onto the cradle with a heavy clack, the echo vibrating through the dark, quiet house. I picked up the 45, slammed a loaded magazine into the well until it locked, and reached back for the phone to dial Joe. I listened for the dial tone and rapidly spun Joe's number into the rotary wheel. It rang twice before Joe's heavy, gravelly voice cut through the static on the other end. "They went after Sarge," I said the second he answered, skipping any greeting. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second, the heavy gravity of the situation settling over the wire. I laid out the details quickly. The black Lincoln tailing her from Broadway, the corner market, the alley behind the print shop, and the point-blank message Frankie's shooter delivered under the barrel of her gun. "If it's a war they want, a war they will get," Joe said, his voice dropping into a flat, deadly register that lacked even a trace of his usual warmth. "And you, Paulie, and I know war all too well." The word war didn't sound like a metaphor coming from Joe. It sounded like the mud, the blood, and the heavy artillery we'd left behind, brought right to the concrete streets of Los Angeles. "Just be careful, Joe," I said quietly. "Always am, Jack." I hung up the phone with a sharp clack, but my hand stayed gripped around the Bakelite receiver. My chest was tight, the anger burning hot and deep in my gut. Frankie had threatened my people. That comes with the territory, but targeting Sarge was over the line. I picked up the handset again and dialed the private unlisted number for the Pandolini mansion. The line clicked open after 3 rings. I didn't wait for a formal introduction from whichever button man answered the phone. I demanded to speak to the Don immediately. When Pandolini's raspy, authoritative voice came through the wire, I told him exactly what had happened on Broadway. The old man went absolutely ballistic. The calculated, cold detachment he'd maintained since the Spring Street raid dissolved into a low, rumbling fury that vibrated through the earpiece. Pandolini had an immense, old-world respect for Sarge. She was the engine that kept our agency running, sharp, dignified, and untouchable. But more than that, the Don had a visceral, deep-seated hatred for some asshole trying to intimidate a woman. To him, it was a violation of the code, a cheap, cowardly move that proved New York had no honor. "This piece of trash behaves like a dog in my house," Pandolini hissed, his breath rattling against the mouthpiece. "He will not threaten women. He does not touch your people, Jack. I am sending 4 more boys to her building tonight. And tomorrow, we don't look for his gambling dens anymore. Tomorrow, we hunt the man." "We'll be ready," I muttered, my fingers tightening around the grip of the reassembled .45 on my nightstand. I set the phone back down on the cradle, the silence of the house returning heavier now, thick with the scent of gun oil and the promise of a reckoning. The bedroom was still freezing when the first pale gray light of dawn started to bleed through the window weights. The fog from the night before hadn't lifted. It had just settled heavily over the shingles, turning the view of the street into a blurred, dripping slate. I hadn't slept. Not really. I had spent the last 6 hours lying flat on my back, staring at the plaster cracks in the ceiling, while my mind raced in a vicious, dark circle. Every time I closed my eyes, the slideshow started up again. The violent, deafening crack of Frankie's snub-nosed .38, the slick New York overcoat stepping into the dark alley after Sarge, and the sickening realization that the fake police uniforms hadn't hidden a damn thing. Frankie didn't just want a war with Pandolini. He wanted to strip my life down to the floorboards. When the alarm on the nightstand gave its sharp, metallic buzz, Rose stirred beside me. She reached out a warm hand to quiet the clock, her movements slow with the familiar, quiet rhythm of a woman who had spent years waking up before the rest of the city. As she swung her legs over the edge of the mattress, the sight of her small, slender shoulders in the dim light hit me like a physical blow. The vulnerability of it made my breath catch in my throat. Frankie's threat from the Spring Street office echoed in my ears, louder than the alarm had been. "I'm going to take every single thing you care about in this city and turn it to ash." I reached out, my rough hand catching her by the wrist, gentle but firm enough to make her stop. "Rose," I said, my voice low and thick with the grit of a sleepless night, "stay home today. Call the diner, tell them you've got a stomach ache. Tell them whatever you have to, just stay inside the house." She turned her head, her soft hair falling over on her shoulder, as she looked down at my hand, then up to my eyes. She didn't look frightened. She just looked tired, the same way she did whenever I brought the weight of the agency up the front steps with me. "Jack, we've talked about this," she said softly, pulling her wrist back with a slow, deliberate strength. "I have the breakfast rush at 6. The girls can't handle the floor alone on a Saturday. And the boss doesn't pay me to sit in bed because you had a bad phone call at midnight." "This isn't a bad phone call, Rose," I pleaded, sitting up completely, the cold morning air hitting my bare chest. The desperation in my own voice tasted bitter. "They went after Sarge last night. They tracked her from Broadway. They know who we are. They know who's in our circle. And they're looking for a soft place to push. And you think they're going to come into a crowded diner on a Saturday morning?" She stood up, reaching for her faded blue housecoat and tying the sash tight around her waist. She looked down at me, her face a mix of stubborn independence and that deep, protective love that had kept me anchored since the first time I walked into that diner. I've lived in Los Angeles my whole life, Jack. I survived the war while you were overseas, and I've survived the people who hate you. I'm not going to hide under the covers like a child. Realizing the words were just bouncing off her, a cold, heavy knot tied itself tight in my gut. I didn't argue anymore. I couldn't. I got out of bed, the cold floorboards biting at my bare feet as I walked across the room to the heavy oak dresser. I opened the bottom drawer, reaching past the folded wool sweaters until my fingers brushed against an oiled rag. I pulled it out, unwrapping the heavy dark iron hidden inside. It was my old police service revolver, a Colt Official Police 38. It was a beautiful, lethal piece of machinery, the bluing worn down to bright silver edges along the cylinder from the hundreds of times I'd pulled it from a leather holster back when I thought a badge meant something. It was lighter than the .45 automatic sitting on my nightstand, but it was reliable. It didn't jam, and it didn't miss. I walked back over to where Rose was standing by the closet, took her right hand, and pressed the checkered wooden grip directly into her palm. Her hand instantly dipped under the unexpected weight of the steel. She looked down at it, her breath hitching slightly as the cold metal touched her skin. The contrast was terrible, the brutal, utilitarian lines of the service weapon resting against her soft, pale fingers. "Jack," she whispered, her voice losing its stubborn edge, dropping into a quiet, hesitant register. "Do you really think I will need this?" I stepped in close, wrapping my large, calloused hands completely over hers, forcing her fingers to curl properly around the grip, her index finger resting just outside the trigger guard. I looked straight into her eyes, making sure she saw the absolute, unblinking gravity of the situation. "I hope to God you don't," I said, my voice shaking just a fraction before I locked it down. "But if you do, Rose, I want you to come home to me tonight. Do you understand? Nothing else matters. Not the diner, not the routine, nothing. You keep it under the counter, right next to the cash register, hidden beneath a dish towel." She swallowed hard, her thumb brushing against the knurled hammer of the Colt. Her eyes stayed locked on the gun, her face pale in the gray morning light. "Jack, I've never shot anyone. I don't even know if I could." "Again, I hope you never have to," I said, leaning down so my forehead brushed against hers, letting her feel the heat of my breath. "Because killing a man is no easy thing, Rose. It isn't like the movies. It breaks something inside you. It stays with you, and it will weigh on your soul for the rest of your days. You'll see his face every time you close your eyes in the dark." I paused, squeezing her hands until the steel of the cylinder bit into our palms. "But if it comes down to a choice," I growled, the raw, protective instinct of a husband tearing right through my throat. "If it comes down to some New York punk taking you away from me, or him being left on a slab, I damn sure want it to be them." Rose looked up from the gun, her eyes shiny with a sudden, heavy moisture, but the iron in her spine took hold. She nodded once, a sharp, tight movement of her chin. She understood. She knew the world I lived in, and she knew that the shadow of that world had just crossed our doorstep. "All right, Jack," she whispered, "under the counter." She turned to pack the heavy iron into her handbag, wrapping it carefully back into the flannel cloth, leaving me standing alone in the center of the cold bedroom. The house was dead quiet again, save for the distant, lonely wail of a foghorn out on the coast, signaling a danger that everyone knew was coming, but no one could stop. Chapter 7. The sun never really broke through the sky that morning. It just turned the fog a brighter, blinding shade of white that made your eyes water if you stared into it too long. The air was freezing and clung to your skin like wet flannel as Joe and I walked up the cracked concrete sidewalk toward the front entrance of the agency. Joe was leaning heavily on his cane, his jaw set against the sharp morning ache in his thigh, while I kept my collar turned up and my right hand buried deep in my coat pocket, my fingers resting on the heavy knurled grip of the .45. We weren't talking. We were just two tired men moving through a gray LA basin that felt less like a city and more like a graveyard waiting for its residents. We were half a block away from our doors when the silence of the morning didn't just break, it blew apart. The low, guttural roar of a heavy V8 engine ripped through the mist from behind us. I turned my head just in time to see a black Lincoln tear around the corner, its tires screaming and smoking against the wet asphalt. It didn't slow down for the intersection. It accelerated right along the curb where we stood, the big chassis swaying with a terrifying momentum. Before I could even yell a warning to Joe, the passenger side window rolled down with a sickeningly smooth motion. The heavy black cylindrical barrel of a Thompson submachine gun thrust out into the gray air. Drum, 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 drum. The deafening staccato roar of the Tommy gun turned the quiet street into an absolute slaughterhouse. A vicious spray of .45 caliber slugs chewed into the brickwork right behind our heads, showering us in sharp, blinding explosions of red dust, pulverized mortar, and broken window glass. Instinct from a lifetime ago took over. We dove for the pavement, the hard concrete scraping my knees as we rolled together into the shallow, recessed alcove of a dry cleaner's entryway. The air above us was alive with the angry, buzzing hiss of supersonic lead. As the Lincoln began to fishtail and speed off, a dark, heavy shape was hurled from the passenger window, bouncing loudly across the concrete, with a hollow metallic ring before settling on the sidewalk. Joe and I scrambled to our knees before the smoke could even clear the gutter, our irons already clearing our coats. We didn't exchange a word. We just opened fire. The heavy booming roar of my automatic blended with the sharp, rhythmic cracks of Joe's piece. We stood our ground in the doorway, pouring lead into the retreating rear of the sedan. One of our slugs hit the trunk with a loud structural clang, and another caught the rear windshield dead center. The glass didn't just crack. It shattered inward into a spiderweb of flying shards, blowing a gaping hole straight through the back window. But the driver slammed on the gas, the big car roaring through the fog before vanishing down Broadway like a phantom. The echoes of the gunfire died down slowly, bouncing off the storefronts until there was nothing left but the smell of burnt cordite, the ringing in my ears, and the steady hiss of a punctured radiator somewhere down the block. I stood up, shaking the red brick dust off my sleeves, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Joe was already on his feet, his cane planted firmly in the concrete, his eyes scanning the empty, misty street with a cold, predatory focus. We walked over to the object they had thrown from the window. I leaned down and picked it up. It was a heavy clay poker chip, wrapped tightly in a scrap of lined notebook paper. I unfolded the paper carefully, my fingers slightly stained with black gun oil from the slide. Written in a sharp, jagged script that looked like it had been scrawled on a moving dashboard were 4 words: "Try your luck, boys." Beneath the text, stamped in faded gold ink on the chip itself, was an address: Angel's Flight Gambling Room. Joe leaned over my shoulder, his hot breath visible in the morning air as he read the note, his face turning to stone. We both knew the neighborhood instantly. Bunker Hill, a maze of decaying Victorian mansions, steep wooden stairways, and high-stakes rackets tucked away right above the business district. If this was Frankie's new territory, it was a vertical fortress of shadows, where the cops didn't like to go unless they had a company of infantry with them. Before we could even process the invite, the front doors of the agency flew open with a crash. Sarge came running out onto the sidewalk, her face completely pale, a small, snub-nosed revolver gripped tightly in her hand. She looked at the fresh, smoking bullet holes gaping in the brickwork, then at the 2 of us, covered in dust. "Jack! Joe!" she breathed, her voice cracking as her eyes scanned our coats. "I heard the shots from the back room. Are you hit? Tell me you're not hit." "We're fine, Sarge," I said, shoving the note into my pocket and tucking the hot .45 back into my waistband. Frankie's boys just wanted to leave a calling card before breakfast. We laid out what had just happened in 30 seconds flat, right there on the pavement, before guiding her back inside and locking the heavy glass doors behind us. The office smelled of old coffee and stale smoke, a stark contrast to the sharp, chemical scent of gunpowder still clinging to our wool coats. 10 minutes later, the side door rattled violently on its hinges. Paulie walked in, his massive frame practically filling the doorway. He didn't look rattled, but his face was unusually grim, his jaw locked tight. In his huge hand, he was holding a crumpled piece of paper. "You guys look like shit," Paulie grunted, his eyes tracking the brick dust on my coat. Then he tossed the paper onto my desk. "Found this pinned to my front door 20 minutes ago. Fucking knife went straight through the wood." I unrolled it. The message was short, brutal, and pointed. "Back off, or we will burn your house down with you in it." Joe let out a low, cynical rasp from his chair, leaning his chin on his cane. Paulie just shrugged, a dark, deadpan smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "If it was just the mother-in-law," Paulie joked, cracking his thick knuckles with a sound like pistol shots, "I would hand them the match." The laugh died in our throats before it could even start. The humor was just a shield against the heavy truth. Frankie was hitting us from every angle, picking at our homes, our offices, and our history. While we were standing around the desk, trying to piece together the morning's events and map out a run up Bunker Hill, the front door rattled violently again. Handsome and Dogface rushed into the main room. The usual cool, detached arrogance they wore like a second skin. The tailored suits, the perfect hair, the calm demeanor of the Don's chosen men was completely gone. There was a look of raw, unadulterated panic in their eyes. A frantic energy that absolutely did not belong on two of Pandolini's top enforcers. "Jack!" Dogface barked, his voice tight, out of breath, and stripped of its usual grunt. "The Don just got a call from one of our eyes on the street." Handsome stepped forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of my desk, leaning in so close I could smell the cold sweat on him. "A black Lincoln with the back window completely missing and bullet holes in the trunk was just spotted pulling up to the diner," Handsome said. "They're at Rose's place, Jack." The world narrowed down to the sound of my own boots slamming against the wet pavement. We didn't talk. We didn't plan. The panic that had choked Handsome and Dogface instantly mutated into a raw, blinding adrenaline that tore through the office. I was down the stairs and bursting through the front doors before the glass had even stopped rattling, the heavy .45 already out and gripped tight in my right hand. Behind me, the thunder of Paulie's heavy work boots, the uneven, furious click of Joe's cane striking the concrete, and the frantic pace of Pandolini's enforcers blurred into a single, roaring engine of motion. We ran straight down Broadway, abandoning all caution, a pack of armed men tearing through the blinding white fog. Every inch of those 2 blocks felt like a mile. My lungs burned with the freezing morning air, my mind screaming, playing out horrific, fragmented images of what we would find when we turned the corner. Please, God, let the colt have been enough. Okay. When we rounded the final bend, and the neon sign of the diner cut through the mist, my eyes violently scanned the curb. No Lincoln. The street out front was empty, save for a massive, mud-splattered delivery truck idling quietly near the hydrant. There was no smoke, no shattered glass on the sidewalk, no sound of gunfire echoing down the avenue. The quiet was almost more terrifying than a firefight would have been. "Irons away!" I wheezed, my voice a ragged bark as we approached the heavy glass door. "Don't scare the patrons unless we have to. Look normal." We shoved our pistols back beneath our wool coats, smoothing down the lapels with trembling, white-knuckled fingers. I threw my weight against the door, the familiar brass bell jingling cheerily above us, a sound that felt completely obscene given the ice in my veins. The diner was packed. The heavy smell of sizzling bacon, burnt coffee, and maple syrup hit us in a thick wave. alongside the low, ambient roar of the Saturday morning breakfast rush. I blew into the room like a hurricane, my eyes immediately locking onto the counter. Rose was standing by the heavy nickel cash register. Outwardly, she looked entirely calm. She was holding a glass coffee carafe, wiping down the laminated countertop with a clean white rag, her movements steady and practiced. But I knew her. I'd known her since the days I wore a blue uniform, and I could see the subtle, telltale signs of a woman holding herself together by a frayed wire. Her jaw was clamped tight. Her chest was rising and falling just a fraction too fast, and her skin had a stark, translucent paleness that the bright diner lights couldn't hide. The moment the bell chimed, and she saw the 5 of us crowd into the entryway, covered in red brick dust, breathless and wild-eyed. The carafe in her hand trembled. Before I could even take a step toward her, a booth near the front rattled. A massive, burly truck driver in a grease-stained canvas coat and a flat cap stood up, his heavy boots planting firmly on the checkerboard linoleum. He had shoulders like an ox and hands that looked like they spent 12 hours a day turning iron wrenches. He looked at me, recognizing my face from a dozen regular mornings, and stepped out into the aisle, blocking the path just enough to force a pause. "Morgan," the driver said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that cut right through the clatter of silverware. "You just missed 'em. 2 greasy New York fucks in a busted-up black sedan." I stopped, my boots skidding slightly on the floor. "What happened, Big Mike? Talk to me." The big driver spat a toothpick into a brass spittoon by his boot, his knuckles whitening as he balled his hands into his pockets. "They came rolling in here about 10 minutes ago," Mike said, gesturing with his chin toward the stool closest to the register. "They didn't look like they were from around here. Sharp suits, but the car out front was missing the whole back window and looked like it took a beating. They walked right up to Rose, didn't order coffee, didn't sit down. The skinny one leans over the counter, real slick, and starts threatening her. Told her to tell you that Frankie was done playing games and that the next time they came back, they were going to leave both of you in a ditch out by the tar pits." My blood turned to pure, boiling acid. Beside me, I could hear Paulie's jaw crack as he clenched his teeth, and Handsome's hand drifted subtly back under his tailored jacket. "And what did Rose do?" Joe asked from behind me, his voice dangerously low. A slow, prideful grin spread across the truck driver's weathered face, his eyes shifting over to Rose behind the counter. "Well, Rose didn't even blink," Mike said, a low chuckle vibrating in his chest. "She just reached right under the counter, pulled out this beautiful, heavy-duty Colt revolver, and cocks the hammer back right under the guy's chin. It made a sound you could hear all the way in the kitchen." The driver nodded toward the back of the diner, where 3 more burly men in flannel shirts and work boots stood up from their booths, their expressions grim and unified. "The skinny punk tries to act tough," Mike continued, his tone turning hard as flint. "He looks at her and says, 'You wouldn't pull the trigger, lady.' And that's when me and the boys from the loading docks stood up. I told him, 'She might not, you greasy New York rats, but we damn sure would.' I had a tire iron in my hand, and Bobby behind me had a heavy-end pipe wrench. The whole damn room stood up with her." The driver looked around the diner, where the rest of the working-class patrons were watching us, their faces set with a fierce, protective neighborhood loyalty. Frankie thought he was dealing with an isolated detective agency, but he didn't realize he had just insulted the heart of Broadway. Those 2 punks looked around, realized they were outnumbered 20-2 by men who throw freight for a living, and they lost their nerve, Mike said, crossing his massive arms over his chest. They backed out the door with their hands up, got into that broken Lincoln, and tore off down the alley toward Bunker Hill. Rose handled herself like a champ, Jack. But you look after her, you hear? "I hear you, Mike," I said, my throat dry as sand. "Thanks." I walked past him, the crowd parting for me as I finally reached the counter. Rose set the coffee carafe down on the hot plate with a distinct metallic click. I didn't care who was watching. I reached across the laminated wood, grabbing both of her hands in mine. They were freezing cold, and the moment my fingers wrapped around hers, the iron stiffness in her spine finally let go, a small shaky breath escaping her lips. "I'm okay, Jack," she whispered, her eyes shining in the neon light, though her grip on my hands was tight enough to cut off the circulation. "I kept it under the counter, just like you said." I kissed her and heard Polly say from behind me, "Since we're here, we might as well eat." Chapter 8. The clatter of heavy ceramic mugs and the sizzle of the flat-top grill faded into a dull, low hum as we huddled over the corner booth. The plates of eggs, bacon, and thick-cut toast Polly had insisted on ordering sat between us, disappearing rapidly under the sheer demand of adrenaline and zero sleep. We ate like soldiers before a push, methodically, quickly, and with our eyes constantly shifting toward the condensation-streaked windows facing Broadway. Behind the counter, Rose was keeping her distance, letting us have the space we needed. But her presence was a quiet comfort that kept the ice in my chest from completely freezing over. "They know we're coming," Joe muttered, leaning forward over his plate, his voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the diner. He used his fork to gesture toward the crumpled note and the gold-stamped poker chips sitting on the laminate table. "They laid the trail, they left the invite, and they are ready for us. Going up Bunker Hill, into a vertical maze like that, I don't think we have enough men." "The Don will see that we have enough men," Dogface replied instantly, his voice a low, gravelly snap. He glanced toward the street, his fingers unconsciously tapping a rhythm against his thigh, right where his iron was hidden. "Pandolini isn't going to let New York set up a shop on the hill. He'll put 20 button men on the pavement by sundown if we ask. 20 guys in tailored suits and shiny wingtips standing out like a neon sign in a working-class ward," Polly grunted, swallowing a mouthful of coffee. "Frankie's lookouts will spot him 3 blocks away before we even hit the first flight of stairs." I didn't say a word. I sat at the end of the booth, my back pressed hard against the wall, letting everything process. My mind was mapping out the layout of Bunker Hill, the steep, winding inclines, the crumbling Victorian boarding houses, the narrow alleys, and the funicular railway. It was a defender's paradise. If Frankie had his shooters entrenched in the Angel's Flight gambling room, a standard frontal assault with a dozen mob enforcers was just going to turn into a bloodbath. We needed something else. We needed an angle they wouldn't see coming. "Jack," Handsome asked, his sharp eyes cutting over to me, noticing my silence. "What's going through that head of yours? What if we don't just have enough men?" "What do you mean?" Dogface asked, frowning. I didn't answer them right away. Instead, I let my gaze drift across the crowded diner. I looked at the long row of stools at the counter, the packed booths, and the men sitting in them. These weren't Pandolini's sleek, calculated operators, and they certainly weren't Frankie's flashy, cold-eyed New York imports. They were dock workers, freight haulers, warehousemen, and long-haul truck drivers. Men with thick wrists, calloused hands, and heavy-end pipe wrenches who spent 10 hours a day moving the literal weight of Los Angeles. And right now, every single one of them was still buzzing with the electric high of chasing 2 armed mobsters out of their neighborhood. A slow, dangerous spark ignited in my gut. I slid out of the booth, the iron legs of my trousers brushing against the table, and stood up straight in the center of the aisle. The ambient chatter of the room began to quiet down as the patrons noticed me standing there, covered in red brick dust, looking at them. "Hey, Big Mike," I called out, my voice cutting cleanly through the rattle of silverware. The massive truck driver stopped mid-bite, his coffee mug frozen halfway to his mouth. He looked up at me, his thick brow raising in curiosity. "You and the boys want to have some fun tonight?" I asked, a hard, reckless edge bleeding into my tone. "Want to help us get rid of these New York bastards for good?" For a fraction of a second, the diner went dead silent. You could hear the drip of the coffee urn and the distant wail of the coastal foghorn. Then, the entire room absolutely erupted. Big Mike slammed his heavy hand down on the table with a structural crack. that rattled his saucer, letting out a roaring laugh. Behind him, 3 loaders stood up from their booth, cheering and waving their fists in the air. The cooks in the back slapped their spatulas against the grill in approval, and the entire working-class crowd broke into a deafening, unified chorus of shouts, whistles, and table-thumping agreement. Broadway wasn't a business territory anymore. It was a hornet's nest, and Frankie had just poked it with a stick. I slid back into the booth, the roaring noise of the diner still vibrating through the walls around us. Joe was staring at me, a rare, genuine grin breaking through the hard lines of his weathered face. Paulie let out a low whistle, shaking his head, while Handsome and Dogface exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated shock. They had spent their entire lives thinking power came from a Don's permission slip, but they were looking at something entirely different now. I reached out, picked up my coffee cup, and took a slow, deliberate sip as a slight smile finally broke across my face. "We have enough," I said. I stood up one more time, raising my hands to quiet the roaring room just enough so my voice would carry over the clanking plates. "Listen up," I barked, my eyes scanning the sea of eager, weathered faces. "If you're in, you meet us in front of the agency at 8 o'clock tonight. Wear your working clothes. Bring whatever iron or hickory you've got. And don't talk about this to anyone outside this room. We're going to clean up our street." Another wave of heavy shouting and slammed fists answered me. I gave Big Mike a sharp nod, which he returned with a fierce, toothy grin, and then I turned back to the booth. The boys were already on their feet, their expressions a mix of grim determination and, in Handsome and Dogface's case, sheer disbelief at the army we just recruited over a plate of eggs. We headed back down Broadway, the morning fog finally starting to thin out, though the air remained bitingly cold. When we reached the front of the office, the jagged bullet holes in the red brickwork were a stark reminder of how close the fire had come. We climbed the stairs and threw open the glass doors. Inside, the usual morning quiet was completely gone. Sarge was standing by the main desk, looking pale but resolute. Standing on the other side of the desk, his hands clasped tightly behind his heavy wool overcoat, was Chief Bill Parker. He'd clearly heard the reports of shots fired on Broadway and, knowing our history, figured this was exactly the place to find the smoke. The moment the door clicked, Sarge looked up. A massive wave of relief washed over her face, her shoulders dropping an inch. "Is Rose okay?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "Rose is fine," I said, walking into the room and tossing my hat onto the coat rack. She handled the situation like a champ. I turned my eyes to the chief, adjusting my jacket. "Hi, Bill." "Don't hi Bill to me, Morgan," Parker snapped, turning around with a scowl that could have cracked granite. His eyes were hard, boring into me with the weight of the entire department behind them. "Are you planning on turning this city into a fucking shooting gallery?" "The option is still on the fucking table," I shot back, stepping up to meet his glare. My blood was still hot from the diner, and I wasn't in the mood for a lecture on city ordinances from a man who couldn't even keep his own precinct clean. Before the two of us could lock horns properly, Joe stepped between us, his cane striking the floorboards with a sharp, heavy thud to break our momentum and ease the suffocating tension in the room. Parker's eyes flicked over to him, his jaw clenching. "Russo, you're just as guilty as Morgan. I've got Tommy gun slugs in the masonry outside and a goddamned war brewing on Bunker Hill." "Chief Jack," Joe said, his voice entirely calm, dropping into that authoritative, steady register used when the artillery started falling. He gestured with his chin toward the back of the agency. "Step into my office, now. I have a plan." Parker glared at me for one more long second, then turned and marched into the private office. Joe and I followed, shutting the heavy oak door behind us, cutting off the worried looks from Sarge, Paulie, and Pandolini's enforcers. The small office smelled of old paper and leather. Joe walked behind his desk, leaning his cane against the wood, while Parker stood by the window, his arms tightly crossed over his chest. "All right, Russo," Parker demanded. "Talk." "Chief, we know we can't stage an official raid on Angel's flight," Joe laid out, his voice low and measured. "Frankie and his New York crew didn't just walk into Bunker Hill blind. They have people on the inside, city officials, corrupt cops, that would tip them off the second a siren left the garage. If you want to bust the rats in your own house, we have to do it completely off the books." Parker's eyes narrowed, looking down at the desk. He knew the truth of it, even if it tasted like ash in his mouth. "Go on." "Jack and I handle things our way," Joe continued, his face hardening into pure granite. "We raid the new place with our men, we draw the fire, we break the doors down, and we flush them out. Meanwhile, you take a handful of officers you know you can absolutely trust, and you keep a few paddy wagons waiting in the shadows outside to catch the rats that scramble out of the wreckage." Parker let out a slow, heavy breath, his brow furrowing as he looked between the two of us. "That's what scares me, Russo. Your way usually leaves a lot of work for the coroner." He paused, looking squarely at me. "How many men do you even have for a stunt like this? If Frankie's entrenched up there, you'll need a company." I looked at the chief of police, remembered the roaring eruption of the truck drivers and dock workers down at the diner, and let a slow, dangerous smile creep onto my face. Enough, Chapter 9. The office smelled of gun oil, tobacco smoke, and the heavy electric sweat of men preparing for a slaughter. There were no costumes this time, no fake badges, no tailored Vice Squad wool. Paulie stood by the filing cabinets, stripped down to his suspenders and a grease-stained undershirt, methodically running a copper brush through the barrel of a heavy Winchester 12-gauge trench gun. Every rack of the slide sounded like a coffin snapping shut. Across from him, Handsome and Dogface were loading extra magazines for their Colt 38 super automatics, the brass cartridges clicking rhythmically like teeth into the steel lips. Joe sat quietly in his corner chair, a pristine government-issue trench knife, complete with the brass knuckle duster grip, sitting on his thigh next to his reassembled piece. I stood by the window, racking the slide of my .45 automatic, letting the steel snap home with a cold, definitive clack. "I've got the layout pinned down," Sarge said, her voice cutting through the mechanical noise of the room. She was leaning over the main desk, pointing a finger at a hand-drawn map of the hill. My informant in the telephone exchange confirmed it. The Angel's flight gambling room isn't a storefront. It's the old boarding house at the top of the incline, right behind the funicular tracks, dead end. The back windows look straight down a 60-foot drop onto the alley below. "A perfect box," Joe murmured, looking up from his knife. "Nowhere to run but forward." When the clock on the wall ticked to precisely 7:58, I picked up my heavy wool overcoat, threw it over my shoulders, and looked at the crew. "Time's up, boys. Let's go to work." We moved down the wooden stairs in a single, silent file. When I shoved the front glass doors open and stepped out onto Broadway, the fog had completely swallowed the street lamps, turning the air into a thick, milky shroud. But the street wasn't empty. Standing on the wet asphalt was Big Mike. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat, his massive forearms bare to the freezing air. A 3-foot length of solid iron towing chain wrapped twice around his right fist. Behind him stood 30 men, dock workers, freight loaders, mechanics, and truck drivers from the diner. They were a wall of dark, heavy silhouettes shifting in the mist. I could see the dull reflection of wet steel, lead pipes, hickory baseball bats, heavy crowbars, and tire irons. Paulie walked over to the side alley, dragged out a long wooden crate of tools we'd pulled from storage, and kicked the lid off. Inside were a dozen heavy hickory-handled fireman's axes, the ones we used the last time. "If you don't have iron," Paulie grunted, tossing an axe to a burly loader, "take wood. Aim for the knees first." We didn't form a military column. We didn't march to a drum. We moved through the LA fog like a quiet, heavy avalanche, 35 men deep, our boots thumping a steady, terrifying rhythm against the pavement as we turned toward the steep, jagged incline of Bunker Hill. When we reached the base of the hill, near the iron tracks of the funicular railway, a dark sedan flashed its high beams twice from the shadows of a vacant lot. I caught the outline of Chief Bill Parker's heavy jaw behind the windshield of the lead car. Behind him, 3 black police paddy wagons sat idling in the dark, their back doors unlatched, their drivers sitting with their lights completely extinguished. Parker gave me a single, slow nod through the glass. The perimeter was locked. The rats had nowhere to go. We ascended the steep wooden steps of the hill on foot, our breath billowing out in white sheets. The boarding house at the top was a decaying, 3-story Victorian monstrosity with boarded-up lower windows and a heavy, reinforced oak front door. Green neon from a hidden sign somewhere inside bled through the cracks in the wood, casting a sickly glow across the wet porch. Big Mike didn't wait for a command. He stepped up to the porch, raised a 20-pound sledgehammer over his head, and brought it down dead center on the lock with a structural, deafening boom. The wood didn't just crack. The frame fucking exploded inward, the door flying off its hinges into the entryway. A lookout in a pinstripe suit scrambled up from a chair in the vestibule, his hand reaching wildly into his jacket for a snub-nosed revolver. I stepped through the shattered frame before the splinters had even hit the floorboards, brought the .45 up, and pulled the trigger twice. The heavy slugs caught him square in the chest, the impact lifting his feet off the ground and slamming his body backward into a wood-paneled wall, his blood spraying across the floral wallpaper before he slid down in a heap. He never even touched his whistle. We burst through the inner double doors and into the main gambling hall. The room was immense, filled with the green felt of craps tables, roulette wheels, the haze of expensive cigar smoke, and the stunned faces of 50 high-rolling citizens, crooked politicians, and New York button men. Anyone that doesn't want to fight better, get the fuck out! Ow! I roared, my voice vibrating the crystal chandeliers overhead. The room erupted into absolute panic. Men in tuxedos and women in silk dresses shrieked, knocking over poker tables and spilling mountains of silver chips as they rushed like a herd of cattle toward the broken front doors. We stood fast, letting the civilian tide wash past us into the street, where Parker's wagons were waiting. As the crowd thinned, about 15 hard-faced men remained standing near the back bars and the private card rooms, their hands diving beneath their coats, their eyes dead and lethal. I flicked my eyes back toward the roaring wall of local muscle behind me. "Kill anyone with a New York accent," I growled. The mob ascended. The violence that followed was pure, unadulterated slaughter. Big Mike led the charge, swinging his iron toe chain in a vicious horizontal arc. The heavy steel links caught a New York shooter square across the jaw with a sickening crack, shattering his teeth and sending him crashing through a roulette wheel in an explosion of mahogany and green felt. Beside him, 2 mechanics wielded the firemen's axes with terrifying industrial force. One gangster raised a nickel-plated .38 to fire, but an axe handle came down hard across his collarbone, snapping the bone with a sound like a dry branch. As he fell, a heavy iron pipe caught him under the ribs, lifting him off his feet and throwing him onto the hardwood floor where 3 more drivers systematically broke his limbs with heavy work boots. The New Yorkers tried to organize a line, but they were completely overwhelmed by the sheer, bone-crushing mass of the working class. Tables were getting smashed into splinters. Mirrors were getting shattered by flying bodies, and the air became thick with the copper stench of raw blood and the white dust of pulverized plaster. Then the gunfighters took over the center of the room. A shooter on the balcony leveled a Tommy gun down at the crowd, but Paulie didn't give him the chance to rack the bolt. He stepped forward, leveled the Winchester trench gun, and pulled the trigger. The 12-gauge blast roared through the enclosed space, a wall of buckshot tearing through the shooter's chest and throwing him over the railing. He hit the concrete floor downstairs with a wet, heavy thud. Dogface and Handsome moved like a pair of wolves along the left wall. A New York punk stepped out of a private office, firing wildly. Handsome ducked, his Colt 38 Super barking 3 times in rapid succession. The high-velocity slugs tore straight through the punk's throat, sending a geyser of arterial blood across the ceiling before he collapsed into a heap of expensive wool. Dogface caught another mobster trying to reload, stepping in close and driving the heavy steel butt of his automatic directly into the man's nose, flattening it into his skull before putting 2 rounds through his breastplate. Joe moved through the smoke like a ghost from the trenches. A large, heavy-set New York enforcer lunged at him with a switchblade. Joe sidestepped the blade with practiced ease, his left hand armed with the brass knuckles of his trench knife, smacking directly into the man's temple with a dull, wet crunch. As the enforcer stumbled, Joe drove the 7-inch triangular blade upward under the man's chin, the steel piercing straight through to the roof of his mouth. Joe pulled the blade out with a sickening tear, letting the body slump to the floorboards as he looked for the next target. I walked straight down the center aisle, my .45 firing until the slide locked back. I dropped the empty magazine, slapped a fresh one into the well, and let it ride. A New York shooter scrambled out from behind the bar, his face covered in cuts from broken liquor bottles. He raised his piece, but I fired 2 rounds into his stomach, dropping him to his knees, before putting a final slug through his forehead. The room was a screaming, roaring inferno of blunt force and lethal lead. Frankie's vertical fortress was being systematically torn down to the floorboards, transformed into a bloody, glass-shattered slaughterhouse by the very people he thought he could bully. The roar of the battle slowly died down into a chorus of heavy, ragged breathing, the groans of broken men on the floorboards, and the steady rhythmic drip of liquor and blood pooling in the cracks of the hardwood. I stood in the center of the wreckage, the barrel of my .45 smoking in the cold air, my chest heaving. As the adrenaline began to ebb, I looked over at Joe. He was leaning heavily against the shattered mahogany roulette table, his knuckles white around the grip of his cane. His face was a ghastly, translucent shade of gray, and a cold sweat was beaded thick across his forehead. The sheer, brutal exertion of the room-to-room fighting had taken a massive toll on his bad leg and his lungs. He was hurting, the phantom pains of his wound flaring up fiercely in the aftermath of the slaughter, but his eyes remained hard as flint. Movement near the shadows of the rear bar caught my attention. Through the shifting haze of cordite smoke, I spotted a flash of expensive wool. It was Frankie. His slick New York overcoat was torn and covered in plaster dust, and he was desperately trying to slip toward the heavy, unbolted door marked exit at the back of the gambling hall. "Frankie," I growled. He froze for a fraction of a second, his hand on the brass doorknob before I crossed the floor in 3 long strides. I rammed the hot barrel of my automatic directly into the nape of his neck, forcing his chin upward. "Going somewhere, Frankie? You should have left my family out of this," I muttered. I threw my weight against the door, shoving him out into the freezing night air, leading him by the collar out onto the narrow, rotting wooden balcony that overlooked the steep incline of Bunker Hill. Joe followed immediately, his cane clicking heavily against the boards despite his pain, flanked by Polly, Dogface, and Handsome. The back door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the cheers of Big Mike and the truck drivers who were still busy smashing what was left of New York's operation. The night air was thick with the blinding white fog, the 60-foot drop off the back edge of the balcony disappearing entirely into a milky void. But we weren't alone out there. Waiting in the deep shadows near the rusted fire escape stood Don Pandolini. He was wearing a heavy black cashmere coat, his hands gloved, completely unbothered by the cold. He looked like an old-world monarch inspecting a conquered province. He had questions for the man who thought he could rewrite the rules of his city. Frankie tried to get tough, his jaw squaring as he looked at the 5 of us surrounding him on the narrow platform. He straightened his tie with a trembling hand, trying to summon that greasy, slick New York smirk he'd used on Sarge the night before. "You think you guys win because you brought a bunch of grease monkeys to a gunfight?" Frankie sneered, his voice tight but defiant. "You touch me, and New York will send 100 more just like me. You ain't nothing but a bunch of Hollywood pussies." He barked the words, but his eyes kept darting to the edge of the railing. He had nowhere to go. Don Pandolini stepped out of the shadows, the light from the small window, catching the deep, rumblesome fury etched into his old face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This piece of trash behaves like a dog in my house," Pandolini said, his raspy voice cutting cleanly through the mist. "Let what happened here be a warning to anyone that fucks with Los Angeles." With a slow, deliberate movement, the Don reached into his overcoat pocket and pulled out his old, ivory-handled straight razor. The polished steel caught the faint green glow of the neon sign above, sharp enough to split a hair in the wind. Frankie's tough guy act vanished in a heartbeat. His eyes went wide, his breath catching in his throat as Polly and I grabbed him by the arms, pinning his shoulders against the wooden railing. Pandolini stepped in close, only he did not finish him quickly. He pressed the edge of the silver blade against the side of Frankie's neck, and with a cold, steady hand, he cut his throat slowly. Frankie made a wet, gurgling sound, his boots kicking frantically against the floorboards as the life began to pour out of him in a dark wave, splashing across the front of his expensive overcoat. The Don didn't flinch. He watched the light leave the New Yorker's eyes with the cold detachment of an executioner. When it was over, Pandolini stepped back, casually pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket. He wiped a stray spray of blood off his own face, his breathing completely even. He tossed the stained cloth over the railing into the fog, then turned his dark eyes to his top enforcer. "Toss this piece of shit down the hill so the vultures can have a meal," Pandolini ordered Dogface, his voice a low, rumbling hiss. "If it does not give them indigestion." Dogface didn't hesitate. He grabbed Frankie's limp, heavy body by the lapels and the trousers, hoisted him over the wooden railing, and pitched him out into the dark. The body vanished into the white fog, followed a second later by a distant, crashing thud as it hit the rocks at the bottom of the 60-foot drop. The balcony went dead quiet again, save for the lonely, distant wail of the foghorn out on the coast. The war for Broadway was over. Parker had the wagons full. Big Mike and his boys left to celebrate with a few beers. The city belonged to us again. Chapter 10. The office felt different when we pushed the glass doors open. The suffocating weight that had been hanging over the desks for the last 48 hours was completely gone, replaced by the quiet, exhausted stillness of a house after a storm. There was no more mechanical clicking of weapons, no more pacing floorboards. Polly pulled a dusty bottle of bonded rye whiskey from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, slinging 5 heavy glass tumblers onto my desk. We didn't make a grand toast. We didn't shout. We just poured the amber liquid high, let the rims of the glasses click once in the dim light, and drank it down straight. It burned all the way down, cutting through the thick metallic taste of cordite and copper that had been sitting in the back of my throat since Bunker Hill. Joe took his drink leaning against the wall, a faint, weary satisfaction finally softening his eyes, while Handsome and Dogface loosened their silk ties, looking like men who had finally stepped out of a meat grinder. It was a hard-earned victory, paid for in blood and iron, but the street was ours again. After a second pour, the bottle ran dry. The boys started to split up, heading out to find whatever sleep they could get. I tucked my coat around me, stepped over to the corner of the room, and picked up Hammett. The heavy black cat let out a low, humbling purr, blinking his sleek yellow eyes in the dark as I cradled him against my chest, ready to head back to the house. The walk home through the fading LA mist was quiet. When I unlocked the front door and stepped into the warmth of the house, Rose was sitting up in the living room, a single reading lamp casting a soft amber glow over her shoulders. She looked up the second the latch clicked, her eyes instantly scanning my face, my coat, looking for new tears or stains. I walked over, setting Hammett down on her lap, where he immediately curled into a tight, dark circle, his tail twitching once against her knee. "It's over, Rose," I said softly, my voice a tired rasp as I took her hands. "The New Yorkers are gone. Everything's going to be okay." The stiffness in her shoulders finally melted away. She didn't ask for the ugly details, and I didn't offer them. She just nodded, her fingers tightening around mine. I headed into the bathroom and turned the brass taps on, letting a cloud of blinding steam fill the room. I stood under the hot water for a long, unmoving 10 minutes, watching the red-tinted water, the white plaster dust from the gambling hall, and the sheer exhausting grime of the day wash down the drain. When I finally climbed into bed beside her, the mattress felt like the only solid thing left in the world, and I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep before my head even hit the down pillow. The next morning, the sun actually broke through the LA basin, burning away the gray fog and painting the cracked sidewalks of Broadway in bright, blinding gold. The air felt clean, smelling of salt from the coast instead of gunpowder. I walked down the avenue with my hands in my pockets, the collar of my jacket turned down for the first time all week. When I pushed through the heavy glass door of the diner, the brass bell jingled cheerily overhead. The place was already humming with the Sunday morning breakfast rush, the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee thick in the air. My eyes immediately drifted toward the large corner booth. They were already there. Joe, Polly, Sarge, Dogface, and Handsome were huddled together, the steam from their mugs rising up to the ceiling. Before I could even take 3 steps into the room, a booth near the counter rattled. Big Mike stood up, a massive, toothy grin breaking across his weathered face as he planted his heavy boots on the linoleum. "Morgan," the big truck driver yelled out, his deep, gravelly voice carrying over the entire clatter of the kitchen. "You sure know how to show a fella a good time. If you ever need us again, we're not hard to find." A low chuckle went through the rest of the driver, as in loaders sitting along the counter. I stopped, giving Mike a genuine, respectful nod. "Thank you, Mike," I replied, meaning every syllable of it. I walked over to the corner booth and slid into the end of the bench next to Joe. Without a word, Joe slid the morning edition of the Los Angeles Times across the laminated tabletop, his thumb tapping the front page. The ink was still fresh, the black headlines screaming across the top of the paper in bold block letters. "Gambling racket smashed. City council members resign. Local police caught in sting." Beneath the heavy print was a grainy photograph of Parker's black paddy wagons lined up outside the ruined Victorian boarding house on Bunker Hill. Of course, the article didn't mention a private detective agency, a 12-gauge trench gun, or 30 truck drivers with iron toe chains and pipes. The department was taking every single ounce of the credit, painting the entire slaughter as a highly coordinated, official vice squad operation. I let out a low, dry chuckle, tossing the paper back onto the table. Parker might clean up the city yet. "Let him have the ink," Joe murmured, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. "We got the piece. That's what matters." Before the cynical mood could take over the table, Rose arrived at the booth carrying a large tray loaded down with heavy ceramic mugs, a steaming glass carafe, and plates stacked high with corned beef hash, golden eggs, and thick slices of buttered toast. She set the coffee down, filling my mug first, her eyes lingering on mine with a quiet, bright warmth that made the last remnants of the war disappear entirely. The moment the food hit the table, Paulie dug his fork into his eggs and immediately picked up right where he had left off the morning before. "I'm telling you, if she stays, I'm sleeping at the office," Paulie grunted, chewing aggressively as he started complaining about his mother-in-law again. "The woman doesn't breathe air, the old dragon breathes fire. Yesterday she told me my ears were shaped wrong for a man in my line of work." Said I looked like a boxer who took too many dives. Sarge let out a sharp, mocking laugh from across the table, leaning her elbows on the laminate. Maybe she's right, Polly. A little symmetry might do you some good. Besides, she's only trying to help you look respectable. Lord knows someone has to. Don't start with him, Sarge, Rose chimed in with a wicked smile, setting the empty tray against her hip as she joined the attack. If Paulie didn't have his mother-in-law to complain about, he'd have to face the fact that he actually enjoys the cooking. I saw him eat 3 jars of her pickled green beans last week. Hey now, Paulie muttered, his thick face turning a slight shade of red as he pointed his fork at Rose. Those were a defensive acquisition. If I didn't eat them, she was going to use them as ammunition. And for the record, she doesn't cook. She weaponizes. Oh, cry me a river, big guy, Joe chimed in, a rare smirk cutting through his weathered face. At least your house doesn't smell like wet wool and gunpowder 24 hours a day. Count your blessings. You've got a roof and a woman who hasn't stabbed you in your sleep yet. Give it until Tuesday, Paulie grumbled into his coffee mug. Handsome leaned back in the booth, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine shirt, completely recovered from the night's panic. Well, if she does decide to put a knife in you, Paulie, just make sure it's after payday. You still owe me $20. You guys are real pals, Paulie said, though a dark, deadpan smirk finally tugged at the corner of his mouth. A regular bunch of humanitarians. The table dissolved into a chaotic, warm crossfire of jokes, insults, and the comfortable, rhythmic banter of a family that had looked into the dark together and made it back out into the light. Dogface was already stealing bacon off Paulie's plate while he was distracted, and Handsome was busy charming a second basket of toast out of the kitchen staff. I reached out, picked up my heavy mug, and took a long, slow drink of the hot coffee. Looking around at the weathered faces of my crew, at Rose standing bright against the neon reflection of the counter, I couldn't help but let a wide, easy smile creep onto my face. The city was still dirty. The pavement was still hard. And the shadows would always find a way back to Broadway eventually. But right now, on this Sunday morning, the sun was shining, the coffee was hot, and we had exactly what we needed. I set my empty mug down with a soft clunk against the tabletop and leaned back into the worn leather of the booth, watching the steam rise from the kitchen hatch. I think Rose and I are going to go see a movie after her shift, I said, casting a sideways glance over at Joe. You should see if Sarge wants to go. Joe froze, his coffee mug hovering a mere 2 inches from his mouth. He looked at me through narrowed eyes, as if he were trying to figure out if I was pulling his leg or setting him up for an ambush. You want me to ask Sarge to the movies? Why not? I replied with a shrug, a small smirk playing at the edge of my mouth. Paulie stopped mid-bite, his fork hovering over his plate as his eyes darted back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match. Handsome and Dogface completely went quiet, leaning in closer to the table to catch every word. You're not afraid of Sarge, are you? I asked, pushing the needle just a little deeper. I wouldn't say I'm afraid of her, Joe replied instantly, his voice dropping into that measured defensive register he used when he was trying to outmaneuver a hostile witness. He set his mug down carefully, adjusting his grip on the handle. It's more of a respectful caution. I remember the way she handled that Evelyn girl. Plus, my leg still hasn't fully healed from last night. She might beat me with my cane if I choose the wrong picture. From the end of the counter, Sarge suddenly stopped what she was saying to Rose. She didn't look up, but her ears had clearly caught her name. I'd pay $5 to see that, Paulie rumbled, a massive, unhelpful grin breaking across his thick face. And I'd provide the cane. Keep talking, Paulie, Sarge called out from the counter, her voice smooth but carrying a razor-sharp edge that made the big man instantly find a sudden, deep interest in his corned beef hash. Joe cleared his throat, a faint, uncharacteristic flush rising under his weathered cheekbones, as he looked down into his black coffee. He didn't ask her right then and there, not with the whole crew sitting around like a gallery of giggling schoolboys waiting for a firecracker to go off. But he did eventually ask. Later that afternoon, once the diner had emptied out and the office had returned to its quiet Sunday routine, I caught him standing by her desk, his hat crushed tightly in his hands as he mumbled something about a double feature down at the Orpheum. Sarge had looked up from her typewriter, giving him a long, assessing look that made him sweat more than a New York Tommy gun ever could, and then she smiled. She said yes. We all went down to the theater after the sun dipped below the coast, the neon marquee burning a bright, warm amber against the dark LA sky. There were no gangsters, no city hall politics, and no shadows waiting for us in the alleys. We just sat in the dark, plush seats with large tubs of buttered popcorn, letting the celluloid wash over us while Hammett kept watch over the empty apartment back home. We all had a good time. For one night, the city was peaceful, the air was clear, and the war was finally behind us.